History is full of wars and revolutions, but today you're getting something far dumber. These are the riots that didn't start over injustice or tyranny. They started over hats, cheese, umbrellas, and other catastrophically unimportant things. This is the side of human history where the drama is huge, but the reasons are microscopic. And yes, every single one of these actually happened. 1. The Straw Hat Riot of 1922 is the ultimate proof that fashion used to be serious business for tough guys with too much time on their hands. Back in the day, there was a strict unwritten rule that a man had to stop wearing his straw hat exactly on September 15th or face the consequences. Apparently, wearing summer headgear in autumn was such a crime against humanity that it caused entire city blocks to erupt into chaos. It started innocently enough with some factory workers knocking hats off heads, but soon escalated into mobs of thousands roaming the streets armed with giant sticks to hunt down anyone with bad calendar skills. They were stopping traffic and chasing people into stores just to stomp on their hats. It sounds like a prank, but the police actually had to mobilize the reserves because grown men could not stop fighting over the material of their hats. 2. The Toronto Circus Riot of 1855 is hands down the most embarrassing moment in the history of public safety because it involved firefighters picking a fight with clowns and losing. The whole mess started at a local tavern where some clowns from the visiting circus allegedly cut in line or looked at the firefighters the wrong way. The fire brigade thought they were tough, but the clowns were surprisingly good at throwing punches and won the first round. The firefighters were so humiliated that they went back to the station to gather their friends and their axes to stage a full invasion of the circus tent during the show. The local police were too scared to get involved in a brawl between the city fire department and professional jesters, so they just let the chaos unfold. It was literally a battle of egos versus grease paint, and it remains a completely ridiculous historical event. 3. The Eggnog Riot of 1826 at West Point Academy shows what happens when you tell future Army officers they cannot have any fun on Christmas Eve. The superintendent had strictly banned all liquor on campus, which obviously meant the cadets took it as a challenge to smuggle in gallons of whiskey to make the strongest eggnog known to man. The party started in the North Barracks and quickly turned into absolute bedlam as the cadets got louder and rowdier with every cup. When the officers tried to tell everyone to go to bed, the cadets decided that sleep was for the weak and started smashing windows and breaking furniture. It turned into a massive free for all where military discipline completely evaporated in favor of drunken holiday spirit. The next morning, the barracks looked like a hurricane had passed through, simply because nobody wanted to put down their cups. 4. The Old Price Riots of 1809 proved that British theatre fans were the original toxic fandom who would go to extreme lengths to save a few pennies. The owners of the Covent Garden Theatre rebuilt the place and raised the ticket prices just a little bit, which caused the audience to completely lose their minds with rage. For 67 nights in a row, the crowd did not watch the play but instead turned their backs to the stage to make as much noise as humanly possible. They brought trumpets and bells and pans and shouted so loud that the actors could not hear themselves think, let alone speak. The most absurd part was when they brought live pigs into the theater and pulled their tails to add squealing sounds to the protest. The management eventually gave up and lowered the prices because they realized you cannot win an argument against people armed with livestock. 5. The Saint Scholastica Day. Riot of 1355 started with the most petty argument in the history of higher education, and it was all over a bad drink. Two students at Oxford University walked into the Swindlestock Tavern and decided the wine was not up to their high standards, so they complained to the landlord. The landlord did not appreciate the feedback and gave them some attitude, which led to one student throwing a wooden tankard right at his head. That single flying cup was the signal for the entire town to explode into a massive brawl between the locals and the scholars. They rang the church bells to call for backup, and soon, thousands of people were fighting in the streets with whatever they could find. It was a complete disaster that lasted for days simply because two guys could not just drink their bad wine and leave without making a scene. 6. The Leicester Balloon Riot of 1864 is a classic example of a crowd getting angry because they did not get the show they were promised. A famous balloonist named Henry Coxwell was supposed to launch his new giant balloon for a festival, But the weather was terrible, and the balloon was not inflating properly. The crowd of 50,000 people had been waiting for hours, and they started to suspect that the balloon was actually a fake or just a small toy. Instead of listening to the expert explanation about gas pressure and wind, the mob decided to take matters into their own hands. They broke through the barriers and literally tore the balloon to shreds and then burned the basket. They destroyed the very thing they came to see just because they lacked patience, which is possibly the most counterproductive riot in history. 7. The Astor Place riot of 1849 was essentially a violent debate between two fan clubs who took acting way too seriously. On one side, you had the working-class fans of the American actor Edwin Forrest, and on the other side were the wealthy fans of the British actor William Macready. Both actors were playing Macbeth at the same time in New York, and the rivalry spilled out onto the streets. The American fans bought tickets to the British actor show just to throw rotten eggs and potatoes at the stage to ruin his performance. It escalated into a massive riot outside the theater where thousands of people threw paving stones and fought simply because they disagreed on who could recite Shakespeare better. It was the most dramatic and unnecessary theater critique the world has ever seen. 8. The Lager beer riot of 1855 in Chicago happened because the mayor apparently did not understand how much his citizens loved their beverages. Mayor Levi Boone decided to raise the tax on liquor by huge amounts and banned the sale of beer on Sundays, which made the large immigrant population incredibly angry. The tavern owners were arrested for selling beer on the Lord's Day, so a massive crowd of thirsty people marched downtown to the courthouse to demand justice. They blocked the streets and caused a huge commotion that turned into a standoff with the police over the right to drink a cold one on the weekend. The bridge was raised to stop them, but the mob was determined to fight for their lager. It was a chaotic mess that proved you should never mess with the weekend plans of a hard-working city. 9. The Nottingham cheese riot of 1766 proves that free food is actually the most dangerous thing you can give to a crowd. It happened during the annual Goose Fair when the mayor decided to be generous and bought huge wheels of cheese to distribute to the people. However, the locals were not in the mood for orderly queuing, so they just attacked the cheese delivery wagons. The situation turned into a slapstick comedy disaster as giant circular cheeses started rolling down the steep streets, knocking people over like bowling pins. The mob was literally chasing rolling dairy products down the hill, while the mayor watched in horror. The violence only stopped when the cavalry arrived, but by then, the cheese was either stolen or smashed. It remains the only time in history where a city was thrown into chaos by aggressive appetizers. 10. The calendar riots of 1752 in Great Britain happened because people genuinely thought the government had stolen time from their lives. When Britain finally decided to switch from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, they had to skip 11 days in September to align with the rest of Europe. The citizens did not understand the math and believed that their lives had been shortened by 11 days. They marched through the streets, shouting the incredibly catchy slogan, "Give us our 11 days back." They thought they would die sooner and miss out on wages simply because the calendar skipped a week. It is hilarious to think about thousands of angry people demanding that the king somehow magically refund them, time that never existed in the first place. 11. The Harvard Butter Rebellion of 1766 is the most pretentious food riot of all time because it was started by Ivy League students over bad toast spread. The students at Harvard were already annoyed by the food quality, but when they were served rancid butter in the dining hall, they completely snapped. A student named Asa Dunbar jumped up and famously shouted, "Behold our butter stinketh," which was apparently a fighting cry back then. The students staged a massive walkout and started suspending classes to protest the smelly dairy. The administration tried to punish them, which only led to more chaos and furniture breaking. It is comforting to know that the smartest young minds in the country were willing to risk their academic careers just to make a point about their breakfast condiments. 12. The Frankfurt beer riot of 1873 shows that you absolutely never mess with the price of beer in Germany, even by a single penny. The local breweries decided to raise the price of beer from 4 Kreutzer to 4.5 Kreutzer due to production costs. The citizens of Frankfurt took this mathematical increase as a personal insult and gathered in the streets to destroy everything. They went from brewery to brewery, smashing kegs and breaking windows because they refused to pay the tiny extra fee. The police tried to stop them, but the mob was fueled by righteous indignation and probably a lot of the remaining beer. It was a level of dedication to affordable drinking that we honestly have to admire, even if it was totally destructive. 13. The Rebecca riots of 1839 in Wales were strange not because of why they fought, but because of what they wore while doing it. The farmers were angry about the high toll gate fees on the roads, so they decided to destroy the gates. However, instead of wearing masks or dark clothes, they decided to dress up as women in full petticoats and bonnets. The leader called himself Rebecca, and the mob of burly farmers in dresses would emerge at night to smash toll booths to pieces. They quoted Bible verses while swinging sledgehammers in drag, which made the authorities completely confused about how to handle the situation. It was a very effective protest because it is very hard to fight a giant angry man who is wearing a floral bonnet and destroying government property. 14. The nylon riots of 1945 proved that the most dangerous place on earth is a department store during a sale. After World War II ended, the production of nylon stockings resumed, and American women were desperate to get their legs back into synthetic fabric. This resulted in literal mobs of 40,000 women lining up outside shops in Pittsburgh and San Francisco just to buy hosiery. When the doors opened, decorum went out the window, and grandmothers started throwing elbows like professional wrestlers. In one instance, a frantic woman actually knocked over a display stand and started swinging a mannequin leg at other shoppers to protect her spot in line. The police had to be called in to break up fistfights over pantyhose, which is a level of fashion dedication that is both terrifying and impressive. 15. The bottle conjurer riot of 1749 is a testament to how incredibly gullible people were before the internet gave them other things to believe. A mysterious advertisement appeared in London claiming that a magician would jump inside a standard quart bottle on stage at the Haymarket Theatre. The claim was physically impossible, but the theater was packed with aristocrats and even royalty who paid good money to see a man shrink himself. When the magician obviously did not show up because he did not exist, the audience did not just ask for a refund. They tore the theater apart. They ripped up the benches and smashed the scenery and dragged the debris into the street to make a giant bonfire. The Duke of Cumberland even lost his diamond sword in the chaos, proving that having a fancy title does not stop you from falling for a cheap prank. 16. The Rite of Spring riot of 1913 in Paris shows that rich people used to have very fragile sensibilities when it came to dancing. When Igor Stravinsky premiered his new ballet, the audience was expecting nice tutus and graceful spinning, but instead, they got awkward stomping and dissonant music. The wealthy patrons were so offended by the weird choreography that they started shouting and hissing at the dancers within minutes. The supporters of the ballet started arguing back, and soon people in tuxedos and evening gowns were punching each other in the aisles. One lady actually reached out and slapped a man in the face just because he was clapping for the music she hated. It was a high society brawl over artistic expression where monocles were probably flying everywhere simply because the dancing was not pretty enough. 17. The Playboy riots of 1907 in Dublin happened because an audience was terrified of the name of a piece of women's underwear. During the play, The Playboy of the Western World, a character used the word shift, which refers to a female undergarment. In early 20th century Ireland, this was apparently a verbal nuclear bomb. The moment the word was spoken, the audience erupted into a frenzy of booing and shouting that stopped the show completely. For the next week, nationalist groups marched in the streets and started fights with the police because they felt the mention of underwear was a stain on the honor of Irish womanhood. They were literally throwing potatoes and fighting constables because a fictional character talked about laundry, which is the most prudish reason to riot in history. 18. The Brown Dog riots of 1907 were a series of violent clashes in London over a statue of a terrier. Anti-vivisectionists had put up a statue of a brown dog to protest medical experiments on animals, and the medical students of London took this personally. The students felt the statue was insulting their profession, so they marched repeatedly to destroy the bronze dog with sledgehammers. This led to the ridiculous sight of hundreds of medical students fighting police and suffragettes in the streets just to smash a dog statue. It got so bad that the police had to guard the statue 24 hours a day like it was the crown jewels. Eventually, the council removed the statue quietly at night just to stop the future doctors of England from trying to murder a piece of metal. 19. The Paris Waiters' Riot of 1907 proves that French dining has always been dramatic, but this time it was purely about facial hair vanity. At the time, there was a strict rule that waiters had to be clean-shaven, which they felt was a violation of their rights as stylish men. They wanted the right to grow mustaches so they could look more masculine and charming for the ladies. Instead of just writing a petition, thousands of waiters went on strike and marched through the streets of Paris screaming for whiskers. They clashed with police and threw trays and napkins because they were tired of shaving every morning. It is absolutely hilarious that the city known for romance was turned upside down by a bunch of guys who just wanted to stop buying razors and look like hipsters. 20. The Zoot Suit riots of 1943 in Los Angeles were essentially a street brawl triggered by fashion, but fueled by wartime paranoia and ugly prejudice. Fabric was rationed during World War II, so wearing a giant baggy suit with huge lapels looked unpatriotic to some. Soldiers on leave decided to play self-appointed style police and began hunting down anyone wearing these oversized outfits. They yanked teenagers out of movie theaters and tore the suits off them in public just because they thought the pants used too much cloth. The absurd part is that the entire city erupted into days of chaos over tailoring choices that had nothing to do with national security. For a brief moment in history, having extra fabric on your trousers made you a target in a city losing its mind over fashion. 21. The Harvard Cabbage Rebellion of 1807 shows that Ivy League students have always been spoiled brats when it comes to their lunch menu. The students at Harvard had been complaining for weeks that the cabbage served in the dining hall was old and disgusting. When the administration refused to switch to fresh vegetables, the students staged a full-blown revolution. They gathered in the dining hall and started a massive food fight, throwing cabbage stalks and bowls at the tutors. The faculty was so terrified of the flying vegetables that they suspended half the student body. It is comforting to know that the future leaders of America were willing to sacrifice their education just to prove a point about the quality of their leafy greens. 22. The Red Flag Riots of 1919 in Brisbane, Australia happened because people became terrified of a piece of colored cloth. A group of socialists marched with bright red banners, which returning soldiers and local citizens instantly interpreted as a sign of imminent communist takeover. Panic exploded across the city as mobs chased anyone holding anything remotely crimson, from flags to scarves. The crowd tried to storm the Russian headquarters, clashed with police protecting the building, and spent days turning the streets into a chaotic carnival of smashed windows and fistfights. All of this unfolded simply because a primary color sent everyone into a political meltdown. It remains one of the wildest examples of people losing their minds over a textile choice. 23. The 1902 Kosher meat riot in New York City is the ultimate proof that you should never make grandmothers angry about grocery prices. The price of beef jumped from 12 cents to 18 cents a pound, which enraged the Jewish housewives of the Lower East Side. Instead of a peaceful boycott, 20,000 women took to the streets and attacked butcher shops. They broke windows, poured kerosene on the meat to ruin it, and physically assaulted anyone who tried to buy a steak. These were mothers and grandmothers slapping customers with slabs of raw liver and throwing huge pieces of beef at the police. It was absolute chaos organized by women who just wanted to make a brisket without going bankrupt, and they were terrifyingly effective at shutting down the city. 24. The Cider Bill riots of 1763 in England demonstrated that the British will tolerate many things, but taxing their apple juice is where they draw the line. The government decided to put a heavy tax on cider production, which was the main drink for many people in the west of England. The reaction was immediate and furious. Mobs burned the Prime Minister in effigy, and coffin makers had a field day making fake coffins to symbolize the death of the cider industry. The riots were so intense that the government officials were afraid to even enter the cider-producing counties for fear of being beaten with apples. It was a nationwide meltdown over a beverage tax, proving that messing with a man's drink is the quickest way to start a revolution. 25. The Bloomer riots of the 1850s were a series of violent reactions to women wearing comfortable pants instead of heavy dresses. When Amelia Bloomer popularized the idea of women wearing loose trousers under a short-skirt society completely lost its mind. Men and even other women would gather in mobs to throw rocks and snowballs at any woman daring to wear the outfit. They would follow these women down the street, jeering and causing such a disturbance that the police had to intervene. It was not a political protest, it was just people getting violently angry because they could see the outline of a female ankle. The fact that a pair of pants caused public safety hazards shows just how bored and judgmental people were in the 19th century. 26. The Winchester School Mutiny of 1818 makes modern school pranks look pathetic because these kids took the whole school hostage. The students at the elite Winchester College were angry about strict rules and the lack of holidays, so they decided to stage an armed coup. They locked the headmaster out of the school, barricaded the doors with furniture, and armed themselves with swords and paving stones. They actually held the school for 2 days and flew a red flag from the tower like they were pirates. The authorities had to call in the actual military with bayonets to retake the building from a bunch of teenagers. It ended with the ringleaders being expelled, but for 48 hours, a group of rich kids successfully fought the British Army over their right to have a break. 27. The Umbrella. Riot of the 1750s proves that taxi drivers have always hated competition, even if that competition is just a stick with some cloth on it. When a man named Jonas Hanway dared to walk around London carrying an umbrella, the local hackney carriage drivers completely lost their minds. They viewed this revolutionary portable roof as a direct threat to their business, because if people could stay dry for free, they would not pay for a ride during storms. Instead of adapting, the drivers decided to form angry mobs and attack Hanway in the street, throwing rubbish and trying to physically run him over with their coaches. It was a violent protest against the very concept of keeping rain off your head. The idea that a piece of waterproof fabric was going to destroy the entire transportation economy caused grown men to act like lunatics and start street brawls just because one guy wanted to stay dry. 28. The Nika riots of 532 AD prove that sports hooliganism actually destroyed civilization long before modern soccer existed. In Constantinople, the population was divided into two chariot racing fan clubs known as the Blues and the Greens. These fans hated each other so much that they would fight in the streets over who had the faster horses. One day they decided to stop fighting each other and team up against the Emperor Justinian because he refused to pardon some of their rowdy members. The result was that they burned down half the city, including the most beautiful churches, just because they were mad about sports politics. It is mind-blowing to think that the capital of the Byzantine Empire was almost wiped off the map by guys who painted their faces and screamed for horse races. 29. The Battle of Hernani in 1830 shows that French hipsters have always been willing to fight over things that nobody else understands. The riot broke out at a theater in Paris during the premiere of a play by Victor Hugo because the audience could not agree on the style of the poetry. The traditionalists wanted classic boring verses while the young romantics wanted more emotional and rule-breaking lines. They did not just boo, they physically fought each other in the auditorium for nights on end. People were throwing punches and tearing clothes because they had different opinions on how to rhyme words. It was a literal brawl between literature nerds who took theater criticism way too physically and turned the arts district into a war zone. 30. The Portland Rum Riot of 1855 happened because a politician was a massive hypocrite who did not follow his own rules. Mayor Neil Dow had passed a law banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol in Maine, which made him very unpopular with thirsty citizens. However, word got out that the mayor had stored a large shipment of medicinal rum in the basement of City Hall for distribution to doctors. The locals decided that if they could not drink, then nobody could, and a mob of 2,000 people surrounded the building demanding the booze. They were throwing rocks and trying to break down the doors to get to the mayor's secret stash. It was a classic case of do as I say, not as I drink, and the citizens were ready to tear the government apart for a sip of the forbidden nectar. 31. The Erie Gauge. War of 1853 was a violent conflict entirely based on the width of railroad tracks, which sounds like the most boring reason to fight ever. The citizens of Erie, Pennsylvania were making a lot of money because the train tracks coming into town were a different width than the tracks leaving town, so passengers had to stop and buy lunch while switching trains. When the railroad company tried to standardize the tracks to make travel faster, the townspeople went crazy. They realized they would lose their captive customers, so they ripped up the tracks and burned down bridges. They fought the railroad workers with pickaxes and shovels just to keep the trains inefficient. They literally rioted to make travel slower and more annoying for everyone else just to sell a few more sandwiches. 32. The New Haven. Snowball Riot of 1854 is the definitive proof that Yale students and town locals have never played nice together. It all started when some students and locals got into a massive snowball fight on the streets of New Haven, which sounds innocent enough. However, the students were apparently throwing the snowballs too hard or putting ice in them because the locals got offended and escalated the situation. The police chief arrived to stop the fun and was immediately hit in the face with a heavy snowball, which led to him arresting the students. This turned into a huge brawl where the mayor had to call in the militia to point cannons at the college dorms. It is hilarious that a childish winter game escalated to the point where heavy artillery was almost used against future Ivy League graduates. 33. The Flower Riot of 1837 demonstrates that you should never believe everything you hear from a guy on a soapbox. New York City was going through a tough economic time and food prices were high. A rumor started spreading that a local merchant named Eli Hart was hoarding thousands of barrels of flour in his warehouse to drive up the price. A speaker at a park rally shouted about this supposed injustice, and the crowd immediately marched to the warehouse without checking if it was true. They stormed the building and threw hundreds of barrels of flour and wheat out of the windows. The street was knee-deep in wasted flour that nobody could eat, which defeated the entire purpose of the riot. They destroyed the food they were complaining about not having enough of, which is a special kind of counterproductive genius. 34. The Surgeons' Hall Riot of 1870 in Edinburgh was essentially a temper tantrum thrown by male students who were afraid of girls. 7 women, known as the Edinburgh Seven, were attempting to take an anatomy exam to become doctors, which was unheard of at the time. The male students decided that women in medicine was a threat to their egos, so they gathered outside the exam hall to block the entrance. They threw mud and trash and even let a sheep loose in the crowd to cause panic. The men shouted insults and tried to physically prevent the women from taking a test because they thought medicine was a boys-only club. It was a pathetic display of insecurity where hundreds of men were scared of 7 women with textbooks and a sheep. 35. The Canterbury Christmas Riot of 1647 happened because the government essentially became the Grinch and made fun illegal. The Puritan Parliament decided that Christmas was too rowdy and sinful, so they officially banned it and ordered all shops to stay open on December 25th. The people of Canterbury were absolutely not having it, and decided that the only way to save Christmas was to start a massive street fight. They gathered in the town square to play football, which was also banned, and shouted slogans about their right to eat mince pies and drink ale. The mayor tried to stop the festivities but got knocked into a ditch for his trouble. It was a riot entirely based on the fact that the locals refused to work on a holiday and wanted to play sports instead of being miserable. 36. The Russian potato riots of the 1840s are a prime example of people being terrified of a vegetable they did not understand. The Russian government ordered peasants to start planting potatoes to prevent famine, but the peasants were convinced that the potato was the apple of the devil. They believed that eating potatoes would send their souls straight to the bad place, or that the plants were poisonous. Instead of planting the tubers, large groups of farmers armed themselves with pitchforks and scythes to fight off the government agricultural inspectors. They were literally rioting to protect themselves from French fries. It took years to convince them that the vegetable was edible and not a supernatural curse designed to ruin their spiritual lives. 37. The coffee house ban of 1675 in London was caused by King Charles II being incredibly insecure about people talking behind his back. The king noticed that people in coffee houses were spending a lot of time reading newspapers and discussing politics, so he decided to shut them all down. He issued a proclamation stating that coffee shops were places where lazy people spread false news and scandal about His Majesty. The public reaction was immediate and furious, because caffeine was the only thing keeping the city running. The outcry was so loud that the king had to cancel the ban just 2 days later because he realized that taking away coffee from Londoners was a guaranteed way to lose his throne. 38. The Battle of Brisbane in 1942 sounds like a war movie, but it was actually a massive fistfight over chocolate and girls. During World War II, American soldiers stationed in Australia had better pay and access to luxury items like silk stockings and candy bars, which made them very popular with local women. The Australian soldiers were incredibly jealous that the Americans were stealing all the dates with their fancy snacks. This tension exploded into a 2-day riot where thousands of Australian and American troops fought each other in the streets. They were not fighting over military strategy or territory, they were fighting because the Americans had better duty-free shops, and the Australians were tired of being the second choice on a Friday night. 39. The Pastry War of 1838 started as a riot in a bakery and ended up causing an international invasion. A French pastry chef living in Mexico City complained that some Mexican army officers had looted his shop and eaten all his cakes without paying. He demanded an astronomical sum of money for the lost pastries, but the Mexican government laughed at him. The chef wrote to the King of France, who apparently took dessert very seriously, and demanded payment. When Mexico refused, France actually sent a naval fleet to blockade the ports and bombard the fortress. It is the only conflict in human history that was triggered because some guys wanted free croissants and a chef refused to write off the loss. 40. The Disco Demolition Night of 1979 in Chicago was a riot caused by people who just really hated a specific genre of dance music. A local radio host who had been fired from a rock station decided to hold an event at a baseball stadium where people could bring disco records to be blown up. They expected a few thousand people, but 50,000 showed up ready to destroy vinyl. When the crate of records was detonated, the explosion tore a huge hole in the field and the crowd stormed the pitch. They tore up the grass, climbed the foul poles, and set bonfires in the outfield. The baseball game had to be forfeited because the stadium was occupied by a mob of rock fans who were celebrating the death of the Bee Gees. 41. The Washington Monument. Stone Riot of 1854 is proof that Americans have always been paranoid about the weirdest things, including decorative masonry. The Pope donated a block of marble to be included in the construction of the Washington Monument as a gesture of goodwill. However, a political group known as the Know-Nothings decided that this single rock was actually a secret plot by the Vatican to take over the United States. They were genuinely terrified that the Pope was going to control the country through a piece of granite. So they broke into the construction site at night, stole the heavy stone, and drowned it in the Potomac River. They then physically took over the Monument Building Society and stopped construction for years just to make sure no foreign rocks could infiltrate the Capitol. It was a literal coup d'etat over a piece of gravel. 42. The Porcelain Tower. Riot of 1853 in Nanjing happened because a rebel leader had a very strange definition of interior design. During the Taiping Rebellion, the rebels captured the city which was home to the Porcelain Tower of Nanjing, one of the wonders of the medieval world. The rebel leader decided that the beautiful tower was problematic because its superstitious imagery might confuse his followers. So instead of covering it up or putting up a sign, he ordered his troops to smash it to pieces. The locals watched in horror as these guys destroyed a masterpiece of architecture just because the geometry did not align with their new philosophy. It was an act of vandalism so massive that it counts as a riot against art itself. 43. The Farallon Egg. War of 1863 sounds like a joke, but it was a very real conflict fought with boats, fists, and pure greed over breakfast ingredients. During the California Gold Rush, eggs were so valuable that rival groups of poachers began sailing to the Farallon Islands to collect thousands at a time from wild seabirds. As profits grew, the competing crews formed official companies and started battling each other on slippery rocks, shoving rivals off ledges just to claim nesting territory. Entire skirmishes were fought over who got to sell omelets to hungry miners. The situation became so absurd that the government had to send armed lighthouse keepers to restore order. It is still the only time in history that a city came close to anarchy because men were obsessed with getting rich off eggs. 44. The Belgian Revolution of 1830 is the only country in history that was started because a theater audience got too hyped up by a catchy song. The people of Brussels were attending a performance of the opera La Muette de Portici, which is a story about a rebellion. During a particularly patriotic duet about the sacred love of the fatherland, the crowd simply lost control of their emotions. They did not just give a standing ovation, they ran out of the theater and started destroying government buildings and shouting for independence. The energy from the opera house spilled into the streets and literally toppled the government. It is absolutely hilarious that an entire modern European nation exists today simply because a bunch of theater fans took the lyrics way too seriously. Humanity survived plagues, wars, and empires, yet somehow almost collapsed because someone wore the wrong hat or bought the wrong meat. Now I need your verdict. What's the single dumbest riot that people today would absolutely start again, and why? Drop your chaos theory in the comments. And if you want more unbelievable history like this, hit subscribe and tap that like button. It helps summon the next batch of madness.